I'm joined as I am each month by Chris Hand, local government expert, attorney, and co author with the late Senator Bob Graham of America, the Owner's Manual. Welcome, Chris. Good morning.
Good morning, Ann. Good to see you as always.
Good to see you as well. I wanted to start, if we could, with a topic that has been drawing a lot of headlines in Tallahassee, but around the state, surrounding a foundation that was created by the governor's wife, Casey DeSantis, called the Hope Florida Foundation. There's been some terrific reporting by some outlets in the state, including the Miami Herald and um, the 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 Times in Tampa. Um, can you just sort of catch us up on why this foundation is at the center of this controversy and why this controversy seems to kind of keep going?
Well, it is, and it really, probably at this point now, sort of 6 plus years into the governor's two terms, probably the biggest scandal that the DeSantis administration has had to deal with at this point. Just to sort of set the stage a little bit, obviously, one of the programs that Florida administers is Medicaid, which is a healthcare program, sort of government financed healthcare program, particularly for financially challenged citizens. It uses private providers to help run that program. The state had a legal dispute with a company called Centene, which was one of those providers, regarding Centene's what are called pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs. That resulted in a settlement of tens of millions of dollars to the state of Florida. As part of that settlement, $10 million ended up with the Hope Florida Foundation, which was something unbeknownst to many people, including in the Florida legislature. Given the role of Mrs. DeSantis and others in Hope Florida Foundation, that has become a significant scandal for a variety of reasons. Number one, the fact that this money that was part of this settlement, and there's some dispute, Ann, about was it actually part of the overall amount? Was it a separate donation? Either way, there's been some controversy about that, but this money ended up with Florida Foundation without the legislature knowing about that.
That's kind of the first
Yeah,
concern.
exactly. So there's sort of a process issue here. How did this settlement happen and these funds come in without the Florida legislature, which under the state constitution is the appropriating body in the state, know about this? But then number two is potentially how those funds were used, because there's evidence that those funds were channeled to opposition to Amendment 3. As people will recall, on last November's ballot, there were two very controversial amendments that had lots of funding coming in, pro and con, and one was Amendment 3, which would have legalized small amounts of recreational marijuana here in the state of Florida.
In which the governor opposed.
Opposed and achieved majority support, but not enough to act the 60% threshold we need to pass constitutional amendments in this state. 10 million, those $10 million from Hope Florida Foundation then ended up involved in the effort to defeat Amendment 3. So this has become a major source of controversy with the Florida legislature, particularly the Florida House of Representatives, led by a representative named Alex Andrade from the Pensacola area, really leading the push to investigate how all of this happened. There's a variety of different Tallahassee stakeholders involved, the governor, the first lady, the Florida House of Representatives, the new Florida Attorney General, James Utmeyer, who was Ron DeSantis' chief of staff when some of this happened. So it really is probably the biggest scandal that the DeSantis administration has faced. And it also shows a new dynamic in Tallahassee. And, really for the first 6 years of the DeSantis administration, there was relative cooperation between the governor's office and the legislature. As often happens as a governor nears the end of his term, that has changed significantly in this session. And one of the ways we're seeing the legislature step up and reassert its co equal role in our state government is through investigations like this Hope Florida Foundation.
And as I mentioned, I mean, the reporting that has been done on this by Politico and the Tampa Bay Times and the Miami Herald has kind of initiated this, but it is truly the zeal of some of these lawmakers to dig further into it that has carried this to the stage that it is now. And there is people, claiming that the man who's now the attorney general and formerly Ron DeSantis's chief of staff, they're using words like, subpoena and money laundering in connection with this. Um, he's the top law enforcement officer, James Uthmeyer is, in the state of Florida. What, practically speaking, could happen? We know that there's, pressure from the House to look further into this. But from a legal standpoint, what are the possible options given that the person that is sort of at the center of this is also the Attorney General of Florida?
I think we're a ways away from that, and because I mean, I think we're still very much in the kind of investigatory stage of what happened here. And obviously, the State House of Representatives is the body at this point, in addition to the continued kind of work of different media outlets, as you suggested earlier, that is continuing to look into this. Until the Speaker of the House tells his colleagues that this process has sort of played itself out. I think that's one thing we can expect to watch over the rest of session and beyond. And, quite frankly, I think it's very unlikely at this point that the state legislature is going to finish its work on May 2nd this year as they're supposed to, that they are
Really?
probably going to go into overtime, maybe have special sessions. It doesn't look like they're there in terms of a budget and some other matters at this point. So I think at this point, the best guess is that as long as the House is meeting in 2025 and maybe beyond, it will continue to kind of look into and investigate. So we're really, I think, still in the investigatory stage of this. We're beginning to get some additional explanations from people associated with the Hope Florida Foundation. Other people, you might recall that just in the last several days, the person who is the executive director of that foundation has now stepped aside. There was some concern that that foundation had not filed its legally required filings with the Internal Revenue Service, like the 990 filing and others that would reveal key information. Those filings have now occurred, albeit, sort of after the time they were supposed to. So there's a change in personnel. There's now some controversy about whether the attorney for Hope Florida Foundation can and will testify before the Florida House of Representatives and the legislature in general. And so we're very much still in an investigatory phase, I think, with a lot more to be learned about exactly what this transaction was and what, if any, laws in Florida did it implicate.
And we should be clear, nothing has attached to the First Lady,
Correct.
Casey DeSantis. There's no indication that she knew anything about this money being transferred, whether or not it was mishandled or not. And the governor himself has said this is basically an attempt by Republican leaders that disagree with him and the media and liberal Democrats to smear him and damage his wife's chances potentially of a run for governor.
Yeah, he has certainly characterized this as a political act by people who are political opponents or skeptics of his in the legislature. Of course, what's very interesting from a political standpoint, and as this is largely an argument among Republicans in Tallahassee, that the focus right now is the governor and some others who you described, as you said, not really on Mrs. DeSantis and her, her involvement with the Hope Florida Foundation, but it's being led by Republicans in the state House of Representatives. So, again, what we really are seeing is a rebalancing of that relationship between the executive branch and the legislative branch. For the last 6 years, we've had a relationship that was heavily tilted in favor of the executive branch on a variety of matters, including fiscal matters during the pandemic and funds that came into the state and how those were used and allocated. The legislature really deferred to the governor in ways that legislators generally have not over time. My former boss and mentor, Bob Graham, when he was governor, I think some of his most sleepless nights were dealing with fellow Democrats who controlled the legislature at that time because there was a real interest in the part of the legislature in protecting its institutional prerogatives and making sure that it was the true co-equal branch of government. We've seen a lot less of that over the last 6 years, but it's really come roaring back with a vengeance, largely led by the House Speaker, Danny Perez, who I think has, and the Senate President Ben Albritton as well. But Speaker Perez, I think, has really been the one who's been front and center in trying to sort of reassert the legislature's role in the governmental process. And when that happens, these are the sorts of clashes that you can sometimes see occur.
If you're just joining us, we're talking to Chris Hand about the latest news from the legislation, the Florida legislature, as they head into what is scheduled to be their last week of the legislative session, but according to Chris, likely not. If you'd like to join our conversation, if you have questions or comments, you can call us at 904-549-2937. You can also email firstcoastconnect@wjct.org, or you can reach out on social media. Um, Moving from the Hope Florida Foundation, but just on that power dynamic, how have we seen the governor's priorities this session be shaped or molded by the fact that the GOP is no longer basically willing to be subservient to his wishes.
Well, I think we've it's been a radical change from one where the governor in previous sessions could feel some reassurance that his priorities in some form or fashion were probably going to make it through the legislature to one where in 2025, and this dynamic will only kind of, I think, probably increase in 2026, one where they are not likely to make it through the legislature. And we're seeing that in a variety of different issues. We'll see this in the budget. Obviously, the governor proposes a budget each year as part of the process. It's the legislature that actually passes a budget. There's already been skirmishes between the governor and the legislature over vetoes he made in last year's budget, and then they're overriding those vetoes. I think that dynamic's going to continue forward with the budget. I think also in other areas as well. The governor proposed a plan to cut taxes. The legislature essentially said that's dead on arrival. And in fact, the governor excuse me, had wanted to make some changes on property taxes. The state house speaker then turned around and said, "No, we're not going to do that. But what I want to do is cut the state sales tax, the foundation sales tax, from 6% to 5.25%." So again, that's another area. So I think in issue after issue, what we're seeing is a level of debate and controversy between the governor and particularly the state house of representatives we haven't seen before. He's issued more veto threats this year, probably than at any year during the legislative session. One example is the Senate and the House are moving forward on legislation that would restore transparency to the process of selecting university presidents.
Yeah.
It used to be the case that that was, covered by the, Florida government and the Sunshine Law. You kind of knew who was applying. You could track that process to the end. That changed in 2022, where the process became essentially closed until there were finalists for a university presidency. And then at that point, the public might become aware.
And that was changed at his request, is that right? The governor?
Correct. Yeah. And the idea, the theory behind it was that we've got candidates who aren't applying because, early on in the process, it might, become public who they are. That's generated some controversy in terms of who has been selected for these jobs, probably most notably at the University of Florida, where former U.S. Senator Ben Sasse became president as sort of as a result of that process.
And resigned under a cloud of all kinds of concerns about misspending.
Correct. And so, now the legislature is doing a variety of things. One, trying to bring transparency back to that process and essentially reverse the 2022 change, but also make some changes in university governance, with the perception being that those would kind of remove some power from the governor and restore it to the individual university board of governors. DeSantis has threatened to veto that bill. There are other bills that the legislature is considering this year that he has also said he's going to veto. So we're really seeing a big difference in that legislative relationship. And there are a lot of factors responsible for that, and one is obviously the fact that the governor's now, in the last 2 years of his term, there's going to be a new governor in January 2027. So there's typically some realignment that occurs with that. But I think politically, there's also a big factor as well. The governor ran for president in 2024. A number of the members of the legislature supported him in that effort. Obviously, he was unsuccessful. Donald Trump won the Republican presidential nomination and now the presidency. So I think there's an effort on part of many legislators to realign themselves around President Trump and away from Governor DeSantis, who was an opponent of President Trump in that election.
It's interesting when we were, discussing, whether this was a subject for today, the idea of, the change in how presidents could be appointed. I was really surprised to see how many, presidents of universities right now are former, House speakers, House leaders, political appointees, essentially. The president of FAU, of the New College, of Northwest Florida State College, of the Manatee Sarasota State College, the State College of South Florida, and FIU. So that's a lot of schools to have, political appointees leading.
Well, and that's something that some legislators have commented on in that process, that, perhaps the perceptions of that, where you have former state government officials going into, these very high profile university or college presidency roles, is something that legislators are now beginning to think that, the perceptions around that may not be positive. And as you said, most recently, Florida does not have a lieutenant governor at the moment because the former Lieutenant Governor, Jeanette Nunez, is now the interim president at Florida International University. So there have been a variety of these kind of high profile roles, educational roles, that former state government leaders have gone into. I think the legislature is getting some feedback about that, and that's helping to drive some of these potential changes.
I want to take a call from John in St. Augustine. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Well, good morning. I was curious if you knew the status of a couple of bills I heard about. One of them would require, as part of requiring auto body shops to report anybody that comes in for service, it would force Floridans to put a front license plate on their car. And then the other one is forcing Floridians to register their pets.
Yeah, I know that the pet registry was being discussed in committee this week, um, but I don't know the status of it.
I think so. There is some. I mean, so I'll address those in reverse order. The pet registration is something that has generated some controversy, as you can imagine. Everyone's very attached to their pets, obviously. That has been sort of working through, particularly the state house committee process. I think uncertain at this point what the future of that bill. I'm not as familiar with with the license plate bill that John mentions there. John, what I would suggest on both of those is you live in St. Augustine, making sure you are kind of reaching out to your state senator is probably Tom Leake, and obviously you're in a state house district as well. Make sure you reach out to those two offices to kind of get a full updated status, and even more importantly, to make sure those legislators know how you feel about the subject. One of the things that, and I've done some work, and you mentioned with Senator Graham over the years on the issue of effective citizenship and citizens using their citizenship skills. That's particularly important at a time like now during the state legislative session, that our legislators hear from citizens about what they think the state's priorities ought to be and how they feel about individual legislation. So, John, one thing I would encourage you to do is reach out to your senator and representatives' offices, make sure that they give you the up to the minute status update, and make sure they know how you feel about this particular legislation, because that's, they're here to sort of, help channel those feelings about particular pieces of legislation.
We have a call from Kendra in Mandarin. Good morning, Kendra. Go ahead.
Good morning. It's become quite clear that the priorities of Governor DeSantis are anti-intellectualism and really pro-white Christian nationalism policy. This is exemplified in some of his anti-literacy policies in K through 12, his what you were just previously discussing within the colleges, that high level of control, and also pulling programs that simply support or tell the truth about historically underprivileged minorities or other groups. And then being, the anti-vaccine, he's far too educated to deny the efficacy of vaccines, but his base is the pro-segregationists. I think DeSantis really wants to model his governorship after George Wallace or Barry Goldwater. This is the same old tired policy that propagated segregation, and he's not doing anything new. He's just more clever about deceiving the people. He spoke several months ago at one of the private high schools here in Jacksonville about abortion. He was with his wife, and from the time he began, it was all disinformation. He stated that one of the main reasons that abortion is legal is because certain types of people benefit from it, people such as George Soros. So this is a really anti-Semitic trope, and he's gone really, really far down the conspiracy rabbit hole. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Appreciate the call. Also have a call from John on the South Side. Good morning, John. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. Being that you're talking about local as well as state issues, I wanted to tie one of them together. And it's the couple proposals regarding the condo, the reforms of the existing condo bill that they had passed that put a big burden on many condo owners around the state, as milestone inspection reports needed to be turned in by the end of last year, December 31st. And as a result, assessments have gone through the roof. Many people can't afford them. It's hurt the existing older condo market. But in the process, when you ask locally, about what's going on, how many were turned in, what it looks like. I was told that there were 29 turned in out of 167 associations. The building department doesn't know how many needed to have been turned in. They're claiming to have just be taken in the paperwork, and then at the same time we had the Phoenix Art District building collapse into Main Street last month. We have there's a historic black black owned National Mercantile Realty and Improvement Company building right next to the $350 million county courthouse that the roof has collapsed, and now they're talking, and been owned by the city since '93.
John, do you have
The
a
city
question
doesn't
for
seem to be.
Chris in particular?
Yeah, what does it look like in terms of is the state passing legislation that the city is actually in accord with, trying to look out for not only the financial interests but the safety concerns that we have regarding buildings in Duval County?
It's a good question, John, and I will let you know we're going to delve deeper into the condo issue next Wednesday. So if you have some specific questions on that front, you can send them to First Coast Connect um, at wjct.org. But Chris,
Well, I think there's a variety of different legislative initiatives that touch on some of the issues that John is talking about in this session. One is, and again, you're going to get into it in a different show, but one is this bill as it relates to condos. As everyone knows, in the aftermath of the Surfside tragedy, where that building collapsed in South Florida, the state imposed a number of new kind of maintenance responsibilities on condo associations throughout the state to make sure their buildings were safe. Many of those are very expensive. There's been concern about the law did not provide sufficient flexibility for different condos, and as a result, has led to significant increase in condo fees and assessments and those types of things. There's been an effort to talk about trying to right size that in this year's legislature. In fact, there's a local legislator, Senator Jennifer Bradley from Clay County, who's taken sort of a leadership role on that. The status of those bills at the moment is somewhat uncertain, whether they're going to come out of the legislature or not. But there are other bills that touch on some of the issues that John has talked about in terms of the state's impact on the way the local government does things. One, for example, is there are two bills, one filed in each house, that would deal with what are called community redevelopment areas. Jacksonville Today reported on that just this week. Those are kind of areas that the city can set up. We have 7 here in Jacksonville to ensure kind of additional investment into those areas to deal with blight or affordable housing or infrastructure, or a variety of things. There are a couple of bills in Tallahassee right now that would essentially end CRAs, which I think would be a matter of great concern to cities and counties around the state who use those to help encourage reinvestment in areas that need it. So John raises a good point. There's a lot of actions that happen in Tallahassee that have huge local impacts, including on things like the safety and future of whether it's historic buildings or other structures.
and the CRA bill that you mentioned, I mean, that does have a lot of people really kind of panicking. There are, 3 of these in St. Augustine, including Lincolnville, and a new one, kind of the West City, which is
Right.
just getting started, and is depending on those dollars that are reinvested in the community through this tax reinvestment. There are 7 in Duval County, 3 of them downtown, and the DIA, the Downtown Investment Authority, is also very opposed to the idea that these could be taken away. Is there what are you hearing about the rationale to do away with CRAs?
There's been some skepticism in the legislature about CRAs for a number of years. They passed some reforms back in 2019, just over 5 years ago. But the subject sort of quieted after that. I think there have been some challenges with a few CRAs in other parts of the state that have led them to, potentially sort of provide this scrutiny. But as you say, Ann, they're crucially important. Just take a couple of examples here in Jacksonville. One CRA that was hugely successful was the one that was called the JIA CRA. River City Marketplace up near the airport was largely developed because that CRA was able to sort of invest funds that came in. And the way, so people know, the way CRAs tend to work is it's a designated area of the community, and they are support.
Typically blighted in some way.
That's right, and that require, some assistance with infrastructure or, or other priorities. And they use a tool called tax increment financing, TIF. And essentially what that means is once a CRA is declared, you essentially cap the property taxes that have been received in that area over that time. That capped amount is continual what still goes to the local government entity, but any amount over that in the future is retained by the CRA. So it can be invested directly in that neighborhood to deal with blight or to help with infrastructure. Again, other sort of key priorities for that area to help encourage reinvestment. We have one in Arlington, for example, Renew Arlington right now, which is being used to kind of help revitalize that historic neighborhood. 3 in downtown. There's 2 in Jacksonville Beach. There's been one in the Sutel Moncrief area in northwest Jacksonville. And Jay, sorry, you mentioned 3 in St. Augustine. There are many of these across the state, really to help make sure that certain neighborhoods that need some intensive care get that intensive care and can fight blight in some other areas as well. So a lot of concern by cities and counties. Now, at this point, it's unclear whether these bills will move forward or not. And the 2 bills that are pending are very different. One would essentially close CRA sooner rather than later and not allow any more projects after October 1st of this year. There's another one that says, well, hang on, we might do this in the future, but as long as projects are finished by the closure date, then they can go forward. So 2 very different approaches. We'll just have to see whether they move or not in this year's session.
We've got a call from Tom on the west side. Good morning, Tom. Go ahead.
Good morning to y'all. My question is about the earlier issue on Amendment 3. I'm wondering if if the state can be compelled to put Amendment 3 back on the ballot because it was apparently the election was tainted by illegal activity, and also the margin was very close.
Thanks, Tom.
Tom, I'm not familiar with a legal vehicle that would require the state to put that back on the ballot because obviously, look, no matter sort of what happened with Hope Florida Foundation, it's always impossible to pinpoint with certainty why did a ballot measure not succeed. You require 60% plus 1 here in Florida. The amendment on reproductive rights came very close to that. It sort of ended up with about 57%. Amendment 3 was majority support, but nothing. So I'm not sure what legal vehicle one could use to compel the state to put that back on the ballot. I do think Amendment 3 will be returning in some form or fashion in future elections. I think we'll probably see versions of both of these amendments again. Now, one key question, Tom, and I think this is something that every citizen should be paying close attention to, is what are going to be the rules around how those amendments or any future amendments can go back on the ballot? That's been an area of, again, debate between the governor and the legislature. The governor earlier this year wanted to make a variety of changes to the way that ballot amendments are placed on the ballot and then passed, including his proposal was to ban third-party signature gatherers outright. The legislature has not supported that. They have other changes they want to make to the process, but they have generally not agreed with some of the governor's changes. So that's one thing to keep a close eye on. Again, one of the main ways we as citizens can be involved in the state government process, beyond obviously engaging with our elected officials, is to place matters on the ballot. And so I think it's a good idea for any citizen to pay close attention to what are the rules around that going to be. And that is a big issue in the legislature this particular session and a big subject of disagreement between the governor and the legislature. So certainly something to keep an eye on for the rest of session, however long that lasts.
And certainly in regards to this specific question, I mean, when it comes to amendments and the way that they are advertised or fought, there's always dark money involved that is a little squirrely. And so if that were the threshold for, a recall effort of some kind, probably they would all be subject to that.
Yeah, and again, voters, regardless of what the different factors were, the amendment did not reach the required 60% plus 1 standard. That sort of is it as far as Amendment 3 is concerned. I don't think there's any legal process that would exist out there that would revive Amendment 3 in that form. But again, I do expect that issue to come back on a future ballot, whether that's in 2026 or 2028 and beyond. I think we can count on that coming back. And important for citizens to pay very close attention to what are those rules and how is state government shaping those rules for that or any future amendment.
We've got a call from Kathy in Nocatee. Good morning, Kathy. Go ahead.
Good morning. I had a question. There was a gentleman who was arrested in Miami and released because he was a U.S. citizen from Georgia. But in the process, our state attorney general sent a letter to law enforcement stating that he would not back up what a federal judge stated down in Miami, that they cannot arrest and follow that procedure. It just seems like, how can our state attorney general decide to not follow the judiciary at all? I mean, is our legislature willing to do something about that?
Thanks, Kathy.
Well, Kathy, with what's going on right now between the executive branches and the legislative branches, this could well be one of a variety of subjects they include. But as you know, we've begun seeing this at a variety of levels of government, notably in the federal government in some ways and in the state government as well. I think it's very important to sort of remind people how our both federal and state constitutions work, in that we have three co-equal branches of government: executive, legislature, and judiciary. And it is incumbent. This is not optional. This is not something people have can choose among alternatives. Court orders, whether they are federal court orders or whether they are state court orders, have the force of law. They have to be obeyed. They have to be implemented. And I think that's an issue we're seeing kind of, there's some push pull on that at multiple levels of government. People saying they're not going to follow court orders. That's not an option. This is not sort of, something that's merely a suggestion or a recommendation. A court order has the force of law. State government or federal government, to the extent that those orders apply directly to them, or local government for that matter, are obligated to follow those orders. That is sort of a foundation of our constitutional system. Again, we've begun to see a little pushback on that at the federal level and maybe in some ways at the state level as well. But I just did want to make clear, to our listeners that, court orders are not suggestions. They're not recommendations. They're not, here's some best practices or good ideas. They're the force of law, and government has to abide by those. They can appeal them. They don't agree with them. They can appeal them. There's a process they
Sure.
can go through to challenge those orders, but they can't just simply refuse to follow them. They're the law.
We have a call from Daryl in St. Augustine. Good morning, Daryl. Go ahead.
Hey, good morning, Ann. A governor dipping his fingers into the healthcare money. What a surprise. I feel like I've been here before somehow with our senator. That's my first point. The second one is that Mr. Yarborough's bill, the peeling free kill, passed every single Senate and House committee meeting by flying numbers, and it seems to be stuck in some back room. Sounds like they're going to even bring it to the floor for a House vote or for a vote, because pretty sure it would pass, and that would be contrary to the health industry agenda. So I've really come to the conclusion that the entire Florida health industry and government is working together in a pretty corrupt way.
Daryl, thanks. And we know, Daryl, of course, you've been very active yourself in trying to repeal the so-called free kill law. Chris, there has been movement on this effort to overturn that law, but there has also been a lot of other health-related initiatives that the state has been looking at involving themselves in, including things like fluoridation, or whether or not teenagers are obligated to tell their parents if they're going to get tested for an STD.
Yeah, healthcare always a subject that sort of, is a major one that any legislature considers, and this one is no different. And on a couple of the bills you just mentioned, obviously and this, I think, for many is a little bit of a surprise, because for years it was sort of established science that, and very common practice for city and county governments around the country to add small amounts of fluoride to water supplies as a way of trying to ensure dental health, which obviously has other health implications as well. In the last couple of years, there's begun to be some pushback to that practice of fluoridation of water supplies. There have been, a number of local government jurisdictions in the last year or two that have now decided to remove fluoridation process from their water supplies. Most notably, the Miami-Dade County Commission just in the last month voted to remove fluoride from their local water supplies. The mayor of Miami-Dade County, Daniela Levine Cava, has vetoed that legislation, so it's kind of unclear what will happen there. Here, there has not been sort of local movement on that. That's something that's sort of a decision that kind of JEA, since it manages the water supply, is involved with. But if the state legislature passed a statewide ban on fluoridation, any water system in the state of Florida would have to stop providing fluoride. So again, potentially major health issue that the state is considering making a statewide decision on, as opposed to allowing cities and counties to make their own individual decisions. And as you say, Ann, some rules regarding parental consent and people under the age of 18, their access to birth control, whether or not things like STIs have to be reported. Again, all examples of the way the legislature involves itself in healthcare, but also involves itself in decisions that many people argue are best left to local communities or local families and others. I think that's one change we've seen in the legislature really in the last decade or so, its willingness to sort of make statewide decisions on issues that previously were sort of more considered to be local decisions.
And in terms of the fluoridation bill, I mean, just so that folks know, we do know that our local senators that voted in favor of that include Senator Yarborough and Senator Bradley and Senator Leak. So, if we're interested in weighing in, but that has been buoyed by the state surgeon general, who has himself become obviously a lightning rod in a lot of medical issues opposing fluoridation.
Well, and obviously, so you're referring to Dr. Joseph Ladapo, who's the somewhat controversial Surgeon General appointed by Governor DeSantis, who has, as you say, has been a figure who, on a variety of issues, whether that was kind of COVID prevention, whether that's the wearing of masks, vaccines, now fluoridation, has taken sort of different positions than a number of folks in the medical community. I think one thing you found, and this is sort of again, a bit of a new dynamic, is where you found sort of medical experts and medical organizations really being on the opposite side of a lot of these issues, whether that's folks in the sort of larger dental community on the issue of fluoridation being opposed, dentists and dental experts being opposed to some of
Strongly
these efforts,
opposed,
right?
yeah.
Yeah. On the bill you talked about in terms of birth control and STIs and whether patients should be able to have confidentiality with their doctors on those. A lot of opposition to kind of what the legislature has been exploring from organizations like the American Association of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. So that is one dynamic we've been tracking in legislatures, not just here in Florida, but around the country, as you're seeing some of these healthcare actions, a sort of new sort of divergence between legislators and some of these medical and healthcare experts on a number of these issues.
We're going to have to leave it there, but Chris, I'm curious if you have to forecast. We were saying this is the end of the legislative session, the final week that we're going to be heading into. You don't seem to think it's going to end on schedule. Do you have a sense as to what might happen?
Well, I was in Tallahassee yesterday, and the sense I got from talking to a number of people was that it is very unlikely they will end on May 2nd at this point. They are not where they need to be from a budget standpoint. The House and the Senate, their differences are significant. And to be finished by May 2nd, there's a certain timeline, a schedule they need to be accomplishing, and they're not there yet. So, on that, whether it's some of the other issues between the governor, I think it's unlikely they finish on May 2nd. Whether they extend the session or whether they come back for special sessions after May 2nd depends where we are right now. But at the moment, I think it's very unlikely we're going to see that hanky drop on May the 2nd and have them sine die the session.
All right. Well, Chris Hand, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks, Ann. Good to see you as always.